The morning of June 22, 1941 arrives cold and gray across the Kent coastline. Somewhere in the marshes near Ashford, a small team of Royal Engineers stand before what appears to be a Panzer tank, all 18 tons of it, gleaming dully in the weak English sunlight. One soldier reaches out and presses his hand against the side of the turret. His hand sinks inward like a pillow. The tank is not made of steel. It is made of rubber. Nearby, sappers are inflating another one with a petrol-driven pump, the wheeze of compressed air mixing with the sound of gulls crying overhead. What seems like madness is actually the beginning of one of the most remarkable deceptions in military history. These rubber tanks would help shield Britain from invasion, would deceive enemy reconnaissance, and would fundamentally alter how the British understood the power of perception in warfare. This is the story of inflatable armour, the ghost tanks that fooled Nazi intelligence and changed the nature of military deception forever. By 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had collapsed. The Low Countries were occupied. The Wehrmacht had demonstrated overwhelming superiority in mechanized warfare, and Hitler was already turning his gaze towards the island nation across the Channel. Invasion seemed not merely possible, but imminent. Somewhere in German high command, the calculation was being made. How many tanks would be needed to overwhelm British defenses? How many divisions would have to pour across the beaches of Sussex and Kent? The answer that German intelligence officers came to was based on estimates of British armored strength. If Britain actually possessed massive reserves of tanks, stationed along the southeast coast, ready to counterattack any invasion force, then the costs of invasion might be prohibitive. The mathematics of war suggested that defense would be possible, but Britain did not have the tanks. Production was nowhere near sufficient. The Dunkirk evacuation had cost the nation hundreds of vehicles. Factories were being converted to war production but could not yet keep pace with requirements. Britain needed an answer to this crisis of material shortages, and that answer could not come from factories. It would have to come from imagination. The general officer commanding-in-chief Southern Command was General Bernard Montgomery. Austere, uncompromising, and brilliant, Montgomery understood that armies are not merely physical instruments of war, but psychological ones as well. If German planners could be convinced that the southeast coast was bristling with tanks, they might hesitate. Hesitation, he knew, could become the margin between survival and catastrophe. In the spring of 1941, Montgomery issued orders for the creation of what would become known as the Camouflage Development and Training Center, based at Farnham in Surrey. The commander of this unit was a man named Colonel John Turner, and his task was straightforward yet seemingly impossible: create the appearance of an armored force capable of defeating the Wehrmacht. Turner gathered around him a remarkable collection of talent. There were engineers, artists, architects, illusionists, and set designers, many of them conscripted from the world of theater and cinema. These were men accustomed to creating convincing realities from canvas, paint, and perspective. Among this group was a young architect named Jasper Maskelyne, whose family had a long tradition in stage magic and illusion. It was Maskelyne who proposed the radical solution: inflatable tanks. The principle was deceptively simple, but the execution demanded engineering of genuine sophistication. A rubber tank would weigh roughly 150 kilograms compared to the 32 tons of an actual Matilda II tank. It could be packed into a container no larger than a heavy wardrobe and transported by lorry to any position. When the sappers arrived, they would locate the designated spot, unpack the deflated tank, and inflate it using a petrol-driven pump. In approximately 30 minutes, a realistic-looking tank would materialize from the morning air. The rubber was specially treated to give it a matte finish that would not glint in sunlight. The turret was constructed with a careful eye toward the specific proportions of British tank designs: the length-to-width ratios, the height of the turret ring, the positioning of the gun mantlet. Photographs taken from the angles that reconnaissance aircraft actually flew showed these rubber constructions to be indistinguishable from genuine armored vehicles. The manufacturing was contracted to Dunlop and other rubber manufacturers who were already producing barrage balloons for air defense. The process began with the creation of plywood molds, detailed and precise, which were then used to construct the rubber forms. Individual sections were manufactured: the hull, the turret, the gun barrel, and then vulcanized together using adhesives and heat. The gun barrel itself was a clever construction: rubber around a wooden core, painted to resemble the rifled bore of an actual tank gun. The rubber was a quarter-inch thick on average, enough to catch light realistically but thin enough to be portable. Ventilation holes were carefully placed and disguised so that the inflated tank could breathe without showing obvious evidence of its pneumatic nature. By midsummer of 1941, the Camouflage Development and Training Center had a complete fleet in operation. Not dozens, but hundreds. Records suggest that approximately 400 inflatable tanks were manufactured, though some estimates place the figure higher. They were distributed along the southeast coast, positioned in carefully selected locations that would be visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. These tanks were never positioned randomly. Military planners understood that German photo-reconnaissance flights followed patterns, covered specific areas on predictable schedules. The rubber tanks were positioned to be seen from the air during these windows of observation. On the ground, they were supported by dummy anti-aircraft positions, fake fuel dumps constructed from wooden frameworks and canvas, and simulated entrenchment systems. The entire apparatus was designed to create the impression of a fully mobilized and equipped armored force. Radio operators transmitted convincing wireless traffic, the seemingly routine communications of tank units conducting training exercises and position changes. The deception had multiple layers: visual, electronic, and procedural. In July 1941, German reconnaissance photographers obtained aerial images that showed, or appeared to show, substantial British tank concentrations in the home counties. The images were sent to Berlin. Analysis began immediately. How many vehicles were present? What types? What was their distribution? The conclusions that emerged from this analysis were exactly what Montgomery had hoped for. Britain possessed far more tanks than German intelligence had previously estimated. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. These videos take considerable time to research and produce, and your support makes all the difference. The psychological impact of these phantom tanks cannot be overstated. German invasion planners began to recalculate. An invasion of Britain would require not just air superiority and naval cover, but the ability to defeat a significant armored force equipped with hundreds of tanks. The supply lines required, the support vehicles needed, the losses that would inevitably be sustained, the mathematics of invasion became increasingly daunting. Hitler's attention, already divided, turned elsewhere. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, which would ultimately seal Germany's fate, was influenced by multiple factors, but the apparent strength of British defenses was undoubtedly among them. The rubber tanks had done their work not through any combat capability, but through the simple fact of their apparent existence. The German Abwehr, the military intelligence service, was simultaneously attempting its own deception programs. They had constructed dummy fortifications, fake coastal defenses, and even attempted to create inflatable weapons themselves, but with less success. The German versions were largely visible as frauds upon close inspection. The quality of manufacture, the attention to detail, and the sophistication of the supporting deception infrastructure that the British had created was simply superior. Nor was the German deception apparatus as centralized or as well-resourced as its British counterpart. The German High Command was frequently working from insufficient information, from estimates made months previously, and from the reports of field observers rather than systematic technical intelligence. The Americans, meanwhile, took a different approach to the same problem. They created elaborate dummy positions using wood, canvas, and paint. Entire simulated camps and supply depots that could fool reconnaissance observations, but which lacked the inherent portability of the inflatable systems. The British approach was faster, more flexible, and more easily modified. A position that needed to be changed could be deflated and moved within hours rather than days. The true operational deployment of the inflatable tanks extended beyond the coast of Kent and Sussex. Once the immediate invasion threat had passed in late 1941, the rubber tanks found new purpose. They were transported in segments to North Africa, where they were used to support deception operations in advance of the British offensive at El Alamein. Here, in the harsh clarity of the desert, where distance and heat shimmer made visual confirmation difficult, the inflatable tanks became part of a larger strategic deception. Operation Bertram, as it was codenamed, involved the creation of fake supply dumps, the movement of entire dummy armies, and the systematic misleading of German photo reconnaissance. The inflatable tanks played a supporting role in what would become one of the most sophisticated deception operations of the entire war. At El Alamein, they supported the false concentration of forces in the northern sector, drawing German reserves away from the actual British attack in the south. Estimates vary, but historians suggest that these deceptions may have contributed to delaying German awareness of the true British offensive strength by crucial hours that mattered in the compressed timescale of desert warfare. The legacy of the inflatable tanks extended far beyond their operational use. They represented a fundamental shift in how military commanders understood the nature of modern war. Perception became as important as reality. Information could be manipulated through careful stagecraft. The entire science of military deception was transformed by the success of these rubber constructions. The Soviet Union, watching these developments with great interest, would incorporate similar principles into their own deception operations. The Americans would expand upon these concepts, creating increasingly sophisticated inflatable weapon systems that would see use in subsequent conflicts. The technique persisted into the Cold War and beyond, with inflatable tanks remaining part of military deception arsenals well into the 1980s. Museums and collections around Britain still preserve examples of these remarkable vehicles. The Bovington Tank Museum in Dorset maintains examples of the original rubber tanks, their surfaces marked with decades of aging, the rubber becoming brittle and discolored. They remain as evidence of a moment when imagination proved as valuable as industrial capacity, when a few hundred kilograms of rubber changed the calculations of war itself. Yet, the impact of these tanks extended beyond the strictly military sphere. The success of the inflatable deception program influenced how military establishments thought about intelligence and counterintelligence. If visual evidence could be fabricated so convincingly, what did that mean for photographic intelligence? How reliable were reconnaissance reports? The psychological warfare potential of the systems was recognized and studied. If the simple existence of tanks, real or apparent, could influence strategic decisions, what other deceptions might be possible? The inflatable tank program became a founding text in the development of systematic military deception as a discipline. Officers began to study it, to understand its principles, to apply its lessons to new challenges. The technique survived well into the age of satellite reconnaissance, adapted and evolved but fundamentally unchanged in its core principle, the creation of convincing falsehoods. The morning we began with the sappers and their rubber tank in the marshes of Kent was in many ways a moment when the modern understanding of information warfare was born. That simple act of inflating a rubber vehicle, so mundane in its execution, so extraordinary in its implications, represented a new kind of power. It was the power to shape what the enemy believed to be true. It was the power to manipulate perception at a distance, to change strategic calculations without firing a shot. The tanks themselves were fragile things, puncturable by a careless boot, vulnerable to any determined inspection, easily exposed as frauds by anyone who came near enough to touch them. Yet they remained invisible to the mechanisms of intelligence that Germany had at its disposal. The German Air Force, the German Army, the German intelligence services, None of them could see through the deception. What they saw was what the British had decided they would see. And what they saw was enough to change history. The inflatable tanks never fired a shot in anger. They inflicted no casualties, destroyed no enemy vehicles, captured no territory. Yet they may have changed the outcome of the war simply by existing in photographs and reports, by convincing German planners that Britain was stronger than it actually was, that invasion was riskier than they had calculated, that their resources might be better expended elsewhere. The ghost tanks haunted German decision-making long after they had been deflated and packed away. In the end, it was not steel that defended Britain in its hour of greatest peril, but rubber and imagination, deception and will. And that, perhaps, is the most British victory imaginable.